Hey everybody, welcome to class number 2 of Organizing the Green New Deal. My name is Nick Caleb. I'm a climate energy attorney at Breach Collective, and we are going to talk to you today about a bunch of environmental justice issues and issues around institutions in the international realm. Today, the speakers will be myself, Jay Monteverde, and Danny Noonan. All of us are at Breach Collective, some in a board capacity presently and others on staff. I'm going to do a brief introduction to our speakers and then Breach Collective, and then we'll launch into the content. So the first speaker tonight will be Jay Monteverde, and he's a co-founder and currently the board president at Breach. In his day job, he is the Environmental Justice Program Coordinator at NAMATI, based in DC, and he's based in DC. And prior to joining NAMATI and becoming the board president at Breach Collective, he worked at our Children's Trust on climate litigation issues. Second, we have Danny Noonan, who also at Breach Collective, prior to Breach, worked at our Children's Trust, and he was instrumental in developing litigation strategies in Canada and the United States, and also is still involved in some international litigation efforts. So I'm going to attempt to share a screen here, see if it works, and we'll go from there. Can I get a thumbs up from another panelist if that worked? Okay, great. So tonight our topic is issues of environmental and climate justice and international governance. I'm going to do just a very quick introduction to Breach Collective so you know who you're hearing from. So we are the organization that's putting on this Green New Deal course in partnership with PowerShift Network, which is a youth climate organizing network. Breach Collective formally launched just back in December, so we're a very new organization. We have a lot of experienced staff members and personnel and board members and advisory council, but in terms of our actual organization, we're quite young. We founded Breach on the principle that solutions to the climate crisis must come from a diverse and empowered grassroots base. And our goal is to increase the capacity of frontline communities by offering our expertise in strategic planning, grassroots organizing, and media and legal advocacy. Later in this course, you'll hear more about some of the campaigns that we're involved in. Tonight we'll be talking more about frameworks, I think. And a little bit about our organization. We're basically two staff from two different organizations that came together to form a new organization. And we believe a lot in labor justice as well and worker management of our workplace. And so we are a unionized, worker self-directed nonprofit. We're based in Oregon, although we have people all over the place, working all over the place as well. Danny and I recorded a labor talk for PowerShift Network just a few days ago, and we published it on our syllabus and our YouTube channel as a part of this Green New Deal series. So if anybody's interested in checking that out, it's posted on those channels right now. Alrighty, I'm going to pass things off to Jay, and he's going to get us started. So go ahead, Jay.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. As Nick said, my name is Jay. My pronouns are he, him. In my day job, I'm the program director of the U.S. Environmental Justice Program at NAMATI, which focuses on legal empowerment, and co-founder and board president of Breach. Excited to be talking with everybody here tonight. We have kind of an information-packed show, so I'm going to try and get through things in an expeditious way. My portion is going to try and do a really quick intro to some of the international, especially the multilateral institutions and mechanisms and sort of the scene, the landscape, and then talk about some of the similarities and differences between domestic and international or transnational climate and justice advocacy. Um, the sort of first thing or sort of starters as far as talking about international law, quote unquote, is that it's all sort of based around nation states. That's the sort of fundamental sovereign unit at the international level, which court traces back to 1648, at least in Europe. And so with, the borders and the sort of concept of sovereignty and nation states is kind of, it's a founding pillar and it's sort of inviolate in international law. After World War II, and in significant part because of the atrocities that happened during World War II, the United Nations and the founding of the United Nations and some of those documents around that founding, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, were an attempt to pierce the idea of nation state sovereignty to protect basic rights and to prevent atrocities. That from the start, it was an experiment, and as sort of memories of trauma and economic and other political factors shifted over time, that success has been more and more limited. And I'm sure many people know, the rise of corporate power has really sort of become a driving force. And so in reality, what has actually weakened sovereignty is the concentration of corporate economic power. The role of politics, economics, political economy, and all of these things that sort of influence how law is interpreted and applied and complied with are even more obvious in the international realm or the realm of international law. And when countries violate treaties or violate binding international commitments, accountability for those violations is pretty weak. The one exception where it's relatively stronger is when you're talking about international trade, like violations of WTO rules and things like that. And these types of trade-related economic mechanisms are some of the most functional and most common and predominant mechanisms of international law. Next slide, please. So something that breach sort of adheres to or is part of the ethos of breach, and also in my work with Namati, something that we focus quite a bit on is that there is law, there is community organizing or organizing and movement building, and there's sort of how to bring the two together. When you talk to sort of traditionally trained lawyers, especially many traditionally trained American lawyers, there's this idea that the law is sort of a very strong concept and sort of adherence to the law. It has its own life. It's its own sort of entity and being. But when you get to the international realm, again, that is much weaker. And so this is a quote from a prominent international human rights lawyer, American lawyer, sort of talking about law at the international level, especially international human rights law, and it's sort of, inability or sort of the lack of strength that it has, the way that lawyers raised in the American rule of law tradition think. He says, what pulls human rights forward is not a series of separate parallel cords, but a rope of multiple interwoven strands. Remove one strand and the entire rope is weakened. International human rights law is one strand woven throughout the length of the rope. And the value is not in how much rights protection it can pull as a single strand, but in how it strengthens the entire rope. So you have here an American trained lawyer who works in international human rights, recognizing that law and the utility of law as a sort of standalone force at the international realm is limited, and it's just one of several different pieces that can work together to protect human rights or to advance justice. Next slide, please. A couple other pieces are that because of the way the international level is structured, there are different and sometimes much more indirect or much less direct pressure points that can be accessed or can be sort of tapped at when you're trying to engage in climate justice or other justice advocacy. National governments, when you're talking again at that sort of international or multilateral level, national governments respond to and they're governing primarily based on domestic factors. When a representative of any given country goes to the annual Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they have a certain remit that they're not really allowed to stray from. And that remit is determined by a wide range of things, but the predominant concerns are national and domestic. And whether you're talking about a sort of quote unquote liberal democracy or a non-open society or a non-democratic government, there's still sort of primacy of the domestic factors and the domestic concerns, whether it's economic development or concern about social unrest or changing of the electorate sort of preferences domestically that drive these international, the positions that countries take at the international level. When NGOs, whether they are the kind of policy experts that are really specialized in whether climate science or environmental science or other types of issues, or they're very sort of grassroots or people's groups, when those groups try to engage, for example, in these annual Conference of Parties of the Unf Triple C or of other multilateral agreements, their role and their impact can be very limited. They can almost be completely ignored. There may be space for them to hold events or hold press conferences, but their ability to directly impact the proceedings or to directly impact the outcomes is extremely limited. Those processes revolve first and foremost and pretty much entirely around the state parties, the countries, the governments that have signed those multilateral agreements. Another aspect of the international level is that international tribunals, specifically the types of things that in the US sense we would think of as courts, where individuals can bring complaints around climate justice or other rights violations, those are extremely limited. And in order for a complaint to be brought to some type of international court or tribunal by someone, that a country has to have agreed to the jurisdiction. So they sort of waive or bow their sovereignty to some extent, agreeing to abide by whatever treaty or whatever agreement is governing that court's jurisdiction. And those are, again, very limited. The US has agreed to perhaps none, I think. And those are another very limited channel. One thing that NGOs do a decent amount, including some US NGOs, is file shadow reports. Basically, each treaty that a country has signed to, I think every single treaty, definitely all of the major ones, have various review processes where countries file reports on how they are doing in implementing the treaty or upholding the principles of the treaty. So this can be like international civil and political rights. This can be economic, social, cultural rights. It can be disability rights, women's rights, etc. The various treaties, they each have a review process where country governments file reports on their progress in implementing the treaty. And there is a process included for NGOs, civil society organizations, nonprofits, to file shadow reports or to file civil society reports. Those tend to be sort of high-level compliance. They can talk about specific instances of police brutality or specific instances of reneging or failing to comply with treaty provisions, but they're designed to be sort of a high altitude picture, and the result of those types of processes are a recommendation from or a report or document from a UN committee that talks about how the country is doing and makes recommendations on how it can improve its compliance. So those also don't result in what in the US sort of legal tradition people would think of as sort of binding judgments in any way or decisions. And so this is not a comprehensive list of sort of pressure points at the international level, but these are the types of things that one can find. And they, again, create the situation where the dynamics are very complex and the channels for pressing on issues are limited and in not easy, indirect places, not easy to find places. Next slide, please. Now I've got a couple, few contrasts of issues or problems that have nearly either mirror images or extensions in the international context. Problems on the left are in the US, and the problems on the right are there either international mirrors or extensions. So in the US, there are land use and zoning fights all across the country. Traditionally, of course, they're about resource extraction or logging, timber sales, or other sort of very extractive industrial activities. In the new sort of iteration of it, there have been land grabs or sort of unfair, inequitable pressure or sort of pushing of communities or exploitation of communities around green technologies. For example, solar farms is a big thing. Irresponsible renewals is one sort of banner that these things have been called, where solar developers, sometimes with the assistance of environmental organizations, are really pushing to launch a development and to get a solar farm built. And they will throw money or bulldoze through local government procedures, local communities, community opposition, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is continuing to happen, and points to the, just as an aside, that points to the importance of really building that grassroots community power and the importance of the principles of a just transition in transitioning, in decarbonizing. On the right, the international side of the picture is something that Femi mentioned last week, and I think Danny might talk a little bit about as well. And this is that as there are programs or initiatives to decarbonize or sequester carbon or remove carbon from the atmosphere, where those projects take place is not equitable across the globe. The vast majority or the large majority are in Africa and other continents that have many developing countries, Asia and Latin America. And so this sort of inequitable distribution and sort of ordering local communities what they can and can't do with their land mirrors a lot what happens in land use and zoning fights in the US. But when you're talking about the international realm or the transnational realm, the ability to address that is much more limited, or at least it requires much more creative strategies and much more creative organizing, much more creative campaigning. There's another piece in this type of, these types of situations that is worth a sort of quick mention. There's a trend of authoritarian governments weaponizing anti-colonial rhetoric to push nationalistic and regressive policies, especially when it comes to dealing with companies or a country's, other countries' governments. For example, there's a lot of use of this is a domestic matter. This is this controversy about climate justice or other rights violations is a matter of internal within the country, and international eyes should not pry. And there is there is a whole realm of international financial institutions, places like the World Bank, and instruments like free trade agreements that traditionally, for sort of all of their faults, they have efforts and provisions in them that at least focus to some extent on environmental protection, labor rights, and depending on who exactly drafted those and the political leanings or policy leanings of the administrations that were signing them or pushing them, they can establish at least some minimum level floor of protections around environment, labor, and other issues. On the other side, there are international financial institutions and agreements from authoritarian countries. For example, China has a Belt and Road Initiative where nearly half the world is getting a lot of Chinese development bank and other financial investment to engage in various types of projects. And they're following that authoritarian line where they say they don't want to engage in any colonialism, they don't want to engage in meddling in domestic affairs, with the result being that the agreements don't contain even those basic, or they contain extremely watered down environmental or labor minimum standards. And so you have this situation where countries claiming they don't want to be colonialists are doing it for regressive ends and doing it to the speed capital expansion and capital use. Next slide, please. Another example of domestic and transnational issue or international issue is when corruption affects political decisions. On the left is something that very recently happened in Maryland, which gives subsidies to incinerators as renewable energy. That is a product of corporate lobbying, and Democrats in Maryland, despite lots of platitudes about equity and justice, environmental justice, wanting to address air pollution, et cetera, they voted almost as an entire caucus in support of continuing or not removing the subsidies for incinerators. Everybody knows that corruption happens in various ways, and there's various challenges in trying to address it or to stamp it out or to have policy be based on evidence or on justice and equity instead of who can shell out the most dollars. And that's difficult enough in the domestic context to address. When you look at the international context, there are these multilateral institutions, specifically the UN-affiliated Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund, which grew out of previous Unf Triple C negotiations, those annual meetings. And these are, the two of them combined are close to $30 billion. And until very recently, the past 5 years or so, they had very, very little accountability or anti-corruption measures at all. And when you think about when corruption is discovered at this type of an organization, how can that be addressed? How is that addressed? Who sort of pushes that issue, and who can advance dealing with that issue when they're not directly accountable to any sort of electorate? There is not an obvious sort of door that you can even knock on, or phone line you can flood. There's not a direct legal mechanism to bring cases. Media attention on something like this is a challenge because of how sort of separated the issue is from everyday people's lives and everyday people's concerns. And so you have these large scales, these sort of large scale corruption potentially that is happening and is very difficult to very difficult to hold people accountable for. Next slide. One last issue is persecution of people defending environmental rights or defending the environment, environmental health. On the left, of course, there is anti-logging protesters or the anti-pipeline protesters who have been persecuted. In the US, a lot of times, well, there is obviously the violence and the brutality from militarized police. There's also a lot of use of SLAPPs, strategic litigation against public participation. And this Protect the Protest is an effort by several major nonprofits to make people aware of their rights and to provide legal access to legal services and legal protection for water protectors, for environmental defenders in the US who are being persecuted. On the international side, it's that much worse and much more bloody. Every year, there are a couple organizations. One is Global Witness, and another is, I forget who put out this report that I've quoted on the right, who put out annual reports on how many rights defenders were killed or were persecuted, false criminal charges or various types of harassment every single year. And the number continues to rise. A lot of them are frontline marginalized activists, many indigenous activists, and the most vulnerable people are among the most persecuted in these situations. And when this is happening at a transnational level, when it's, for example, a Canadian mining company doing this to people in the Philippines or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the ways to hold that company account, or the ways to even elevate the issue so that there's some critical mass of people who are paying attention to it, it's extremely difficult. Next slide. Extremely quick, not really doing justice to the topic, but some things that I thought might be worth touching on from a strategies perspective. These things that are, these are strategies that are useful both in the domestic and the international context. First is impact, especially at the international level when you're talking about the Unf Triple C annual conference of parties that have been going on for 20 plus years now, or is my math wrong? And that's 30 decades. Meanwhile, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and things continue to get worse. So, there's a lot of time and energy and resources spent on these meetings to bring lots of people to a single place and supposedly come up with solutions, but where is that? Or what is the impact of that work? And so whatever type of work one is engaging in, especially at the international level, just keeping an eye on what impact is this creating. Even if, at the international level, sometimes the best you can do is sort of affect the decision, but how much energy and time is being put into something that can at best affect the discourse, affect the conversation. The second is resisting blind worship of technocracy or complexity. This, again, is something that has happened in the US environmental movement and is also very common internationally. Just this real sort of energy to make things more and more specialized, more and more complicated, to a sort of worshiping kind of level, where the complexity almost for complexity's sake is preferred. And the result of that, of course, is to make things less democratic, to make things less accessible, even if you're not explicitly or formally sort of saying, limiting how many people can talk about an issue just by virtue of how complex it's made. That limits the amount of people who can talk about the issue and the amount of people who can participate in that discussion. So that's inherently anti-democratic. The last is something that, again, critical in domestic and international, is just building grassroots power. It continues to be something that is when done strategically, is one of the more effective ways, or one of the ways that it has a better chances of getting actual impact and results. And then especially connecting that across countries when you're talking about international level. Next slide, please. That does come with some additional sort of complexity as well. This here I've highlighted a sort of cautionary tale that I saw kind of happen last year. And further back in my work, I did quite a bit of work in human rights and rule of law reform in China and a little bit in Hong Kong. So last year when Black Lives Matter movement sort of exploded, I watched with great interest as, especially I think in the Pacific Northwest, there was a lot of learning and a lot of sort of borrowing strategies and tactics from of protesters in the Pacific Northwest from the Hong Kong democratic protesters or pro-democracy protesters that dealt with the same kinds of police brutality, or very similar kinds of police brutality over the course of the past year. So it was really sort of heartwarming to see these two sort of parallel movements or parallel sort of uprisings learn from each other, and that to those strategies to be shared. But then at the same time, there were some shortcomings with it. There was an event that happened last summer, or that was supposed to happen last summer, where Sunrise Movement, and just as a descriptor, I was not directly involved in the organizing of that event, and I'm not mentioning Sunrise to call them out or anything. But Sunrise Movement was hosting an event where they were going to invite organizers from Hong Kong democracy, the Hong Kong democracy movement, to talk about how they're pushing forward and their strategies, et cetera, et cetera. And this became a sort of flashpoint and became extremely controversial for a few different factors, for a few different reasons. First, parts of the left in the US perceive that China is a critic of the US and is at least nominally a leftist government. And so some people were not comfortable with this event supporting an anti-China movement, the Hong Kong democratic protesters being anti-Beijing or anti-Beijing's repressive policies. So that was one thing that happened. And then another part that fanned those flames was that some protesters in Hong Kong in the democracy movement, they were flag waving and they adored the previous US administration and loved Trump because they saw him as criticizing China. So you had two sort of movements, the US left, or the sort of progressive left in the US, and the democracy movement in Hong Kong, trying to really come together and support each other and learn from each other. But due to this lack of understanding and sort of a kind of simplistic look at what the other is facing and the context that they're working in, some of that didn't go as planned. So that event was canceled. And there was this unfortunate controversy, and at least that particular opportunity for learning from each other and working together didn't materialize. I think I have gone on really, really long, so I'm going to pass the mic back to Nick.
I'm going to immediately pass it to Danny. Jump in here.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this week's session. My name's Danny. I am a team member at Breach Collective. And first, I'm just going to make sure that my audio is coming through clearly. Going to get a thumbs up. Great. Well, sort of building off of Jay's very thoughtful sort of overview of international law and the relationship between local campaigns and issues, and then sort of international and transnational advocacy. I'm going to focus my presentation on the relationship between international climate governance and institutions and domestic advocacy. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the origins and the meaning of things like the 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees temperature targets, the idea of achieving net zero emissions by the year 2050 or sooner, and also the idea that we have 12 years, or that sort of became a meme in 2018. So I think it's now 10 or 9 years left to solve climate change. Each of these sort of political demands has their origins in either the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the treaties that have been made under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But the relationship between each of these ideas, each of these targets, is not straightforward, and I think that relationship sometimes gets a little sort of confused or distorted when it's translated to political demands at the national or state or local level. And so this initial slide just sort of shows, just at a very high level, the sort of relationship between the Ipcc and the Unf Triple C, and shows that they sort of are both UN institutions. But if we can go to the next slide, please. This is a chart I've put together that helps sort of elaborate the relationship between the Ipcc and the Unf Triple C. And we are sharing the slides, so you can sort of, if you're the kind of person who finds that interesting, study this in your spare time. But just to give a brief overview, the Ipcc was established in 1988. It's the world's sort of leading institution for assessing and synthesizing scientific information on climate change. But it wasn't the first institution of its type. There actually was a previous international body that was active in the mid-80s called the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases. And there's sort of a little bit of a lost fact of history, but the Ipcc developed in part because that original group was issuing some pretty alarming findings as early as the mid-1980s, and was essentially just run by a couple scientists and UN bureaucrats, and governments like the United States thought, hold on, there needs to be more sort of governmental oversight of this work. We're not sure we, like what the implications of some of the stuff that they're putting out. And so the Ipcc was established very deliberately to have multiple levels of government review and influence over its processes. And so the main function of the Ipcc is to, as I mentioned, sort of synthesize, assess, and present findings based on the scientific literature on climate change. And it does this through periodic assessment reports, which are massive publications that are sort of a comprehensive assessment of the impacts of climate change, the trajectories needed to assess climate change, issues of sustainable development, et cetera, et cetera. And then it does sort of one-off special reports as well. Probably the most famous of this is the 1.5 degree special report, which is where that 12 years framing sort of originated. And I'll talk a little bit about the specific paragraph in that report. But this reporting process, there are sort of multiple levels of government review built into it. And what this does is it can sometimes lead to the findings being quite conservative compared to sort of, individual scientific papers, because they sort of tend to err on the side of caution, and the government say, this is just one paper, I don't think you can make findings based on that. But it also gives a particular legitimacy to its findings, because essentially all the governments in the world have had to sign off on it before the summary for policymakers in each report is produced. So that's the Ipcc. The Unf Triple C, as its name implies, as a framework convention, is actually an international treaty, but it does have its own international organization. This is called the Unf Triple C Secretariat, and it also has its own scientific assessment body, which is the SBSTA, or the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice. But I'll just sort of talk briefly about the framework treaty process and what's meant by a framework treaty for those who aren't sort of familiar with international agreements and things like that, is that it's a treaty that's designed to sort of have its detail sort of fleshed out by subsequent negotiations. And so those are the COPs, the conferences of parties to the UNFCCC, of which there's been 20 something at this point. The first one was was the year after 1990, so it was in 1995. So I think there's been 25 or 26 at this point. And so some of these subsequent treaties include things like the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accords, the Paris Agreement, of course, which is where the 1.5 degree temperature target comes from. And each of these agreements has sort of been working towards the ultimate objective of the UNFCCC, which is to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at levels that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That's the sort of the magic term that's used there. And so, of course, part of the work under the UNFCCC in its processes has been trying to figure out what dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate is. And naturally, as part of that, that process, the governments who've been negotiating under the UNFCCC have been working very closely with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this has created, if we can go to the next slide, please. This has created what is sometimes called the science policy nexus in international climate governance, which is sort of the relationship at the international level between the sort of scientific assessment process and then how that translates into international policy making, or which is essentially made through treaties. And so we have, and so one of the problems with this, and one of the problems with the UNFCCC trying to define dangerous anthropogenic interference, is that the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the people responsible for that don't consider it appropriate to define a particular level of warming or a particular level of emissions as dangerous. And that's the quote that you can see from the Ipcc's fifth assessment report in the top right corner, which is that they consider that a matter for the political processes. The Ipcc did go so far in its 1.5 degree special report to be sort of explicit that warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius is not considered safe for most nations, communities, ecosystems, and sectors. That was in chapter 5 of that report. But it hasn't gone so far in any of the reports I've seen to say that 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees is a safe target, that it's an appropriate target. It's sort of had its hands off of that and said this is a matter for governments to decide. And so this is sort of encapsulated in this quote on the left, which, to repeat, policymakers often look at, things like the 2 degree temperature target and the 1.5 degree temperature target as being sort of supported by the latest climate science and based on the latest climate science. But scientists say, well, no, this isn't a scientific finding. This is a policy finding. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So that's, I suppose, the relationship between the Ipcc and the UNFCCC when it comes to temperature targets. When it comes to something like net zero in 12 years and how that's sort of become a policy demand in a lot of different spaces. And you even have countries like, you even have companies like Shell now saying that they support a net zero by 2050 target, or you have the Australian Association of Petroleum Producers, for example, I saw on the news saying that they support a net zero by 2050 target. That target originates in the 1.5 degree special report in the summary for policymakers. And what the Ipcc is saying here is it's saying, if you want to avoid going above 1.5 degrees of warming. And if you want to have less warming by the end of this century, then this is what probably needs to happen. You need to have emissions halve by around 2030. And this report came out in 2018, so that's where the 12 years came from. And you need to reach net zero by around 2050. But as you can see, these are ranges based on different pathways. So if we go to the next slide. This is the section of the Paris Agreement on the left that sets the 1.5 degree temperature target. And you can see it's actually not just a 1.5 degree temperature target, it's a target to attempt to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius to pursue efforts. And it's also, there's a target there to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees. And I don't think anyone's been able to figure out sort of in a quantitative sense what well below 2 degrees means. You know, how far below? Is it 1.6 degrees? Is it 1.7 degrees? It's not clear. But this is the text that they came up with through negotiations between 190 something countries that are parties to the Unf Triple C. But the problem this creates in terms of trying to create domestic demands of, you know, of governments at the national level, at the state level, is that there's a sort of really broad range of interpretation here as to what these targets mean. And this is represented by the graphic on the right. And it sort of shows that there's sort of a range of different pathways for sort of a range of different ways of interpreting 1.5 degrees. And so what they did, what the Ipcc did in their 2018 report is they sort of said, well, you can interpret 1.5 degrees as a sort of peak temperature rise. And then, you know, you hit that, and then later in the century, you hit, you know, 1.3 degrees or something like that, and you know, that temperature keeps going down. Or you can treat it as a destination. You want to try and sort of stabilize global temperatures at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Or maybe it's, you know, a sort of, maybe it's not a destination in the year 2100, maybe it's a destination in the year 2150 or something. So you have even more of an overshoot. And they did a bunch of different emissions modeling to sort of encompass all these different ways of interpreting it. But if you can go to the next slide, please. But the problem with this is that those different interpretations of a temperature target have really different real world consequences in terms of damage to the climate. And so what these two charts show, which is from an Australian climate author named Ketan Joshi, is that these are different ways of reaching net zero by 2050. You can have a pathway that has sort of very rapid reductions early on and then sort of tapers off, or you can have one that, you know, has very slow reductions early on and then tries to get all of them done, you know, in the sort of the 2040s. But the difference in terms of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions over that time is massive. And those cumulative greenhouse gas emissions is what ends up causing warming and ends up causing climate impacts. So there's a lot at stake in terms of how you interpret the language of the Paris Agreement and apply that at the local level. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And speaking of the local level, one of the issues that Jay identified with international law generally is the sort of lack of accountability and lack of enforceability. And I'm going to talk about that a little. And one of the interesting things about the Paris Agreement is that it does very much rely on domestic enforcement, and it marked a departure from the negotiation process that broke down in Copenhagen, which was, you know, an attempt to sort of define at the, you know, among all the different parties, you know, how many emissions China would commit to reducing by a certain time, and how many the United States would, and India and Russia. And they, instead of that, they sort of set the temperature target and then said, everyone's going to go away and figure out what level of reductions they're willing to do, and they're going to submit that. And then we're all going to review them periodically and try and increase the ambition over time. And this is called the nationally determined contribution approach, and it's a form of bottom-up accountability. And we can see here with this chart on the right that if you sort of take all of these different nationally determined contributions to the temperature targets in the Paris Agreement, you can see that they're sort of critically insufficient at this point, that optimistically we're sort of headed for around a bit over 2 degrees of warming, which is not well below 2 degrees, but that it's more likely we're either heading for between 2.1 and 3.3 degrees, or potentially as much as 3.9 degrees Celsius if governments don't comply with their current commitments. So basically, they've assessed all the different existing policies of governments in the world, have aggregated them, and it could lead to as much as 4 degrees of warming. So we're a long way away from the Paris Agreement's goals through this sort of bottom-up model of accountability. You can go to the next slide, please, Nick. Excuse me. One way in which individuals and organizations have sought to try and get some accountability, governmental accountability to achieve either the targets the governments have set for themselves, or more often to achieve international temperature targets, or to make a proportionate contribution to the global burden of emissions reductions in recent years has been through domestic climate lawsuits. And so this is just a quote from the UN Environment Programme and Savin Centre, pointing out that increasingly these lawsuits have been based on constitutional or human rights. And the most famous court case so far is the Dutch agenda decision, which succeeded at every stage, at the sort of the domestic court, at the appellate court, at the district court, the appellate court, and then the Supreme Court, in holding the government to a target. But if we go to the next slide, again, I'm sort of mindful of where we are for time, and I want to make sure we have plenty of opportunity for questions and discussion. But this is a summary of several domestic and one international lawsuit that have been filed seeking some sort of accountability on governments for climate change. And there's been quite a few issues with this sort of model or approach to accountability. And so the first of these is that some of the most ambitious lawsuits in terms of what they're asking for from governments have also been some of the least successful. And so the Juliana case is a good example of this. Its appeal, most recent appeal, was denied by the Ninth Circuit, I believe last week. And you can sort of contrast this to the agenda decision, which was asking for much less sort of ambitious emissions reductions. And I'm happy to answer a question, later on about, where that target, that 25 to 40% below 1990 levels by 2020 came from, and things like that. But the agenda plaintiffs were asking for a 2-degree target, and they were able to get that. But often, even when a case is successful, the courts won't go so far as to order sort of a sufficient remedy. And the New Zealand Thompson case was an example of this, where because there had been a change of government, the court decided that it would not require the incoming government to set a new target, because they had said that they were probably going to anyway. And so the courts sort of tend to be reluctant to force governments to take action on climate change generally, and even when they do sort of agree with the legal arguments of the plaintiffs. And I think I'll just comment briefly on the last case, the furthest to the right here, which is currently progressing through the European Court of Human Rights. This is a case that I am involved with. and it's being supported by the Global Legal Action Network. And one of the things that distinguishes this case is that it is seeking for the European Court of Human Rights to hold the state defendants, to require them to demonstrate that they are making an equitable contribution to the 1.5 degree target, not just that they are contributing to it in some way or doing what, the equivalent of what is necessary globally, but that they're taking into account things like their per capita responsibility or their historical responsibility, or their ability as a country, economically, or in terms of their sort of technology and physical space, that they're making an appropriate contribution in that way. And so this could potentially greatly assist with accountability in Europe. But I think what this summary shows as a whole is that litigation is at best probably an imperfect or incomplete method or tool for achieving accountability for global climate targets. Next slide, please. And so on that point, and I just did allude to this, the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities that each country should contribute to a global temperature target in a somewhat of a different way, depending on what its responsibility is and what its capability is and what's cost effective, is part of the Paris Agreement. It's mentioned in Article 4.3. But it's the Climate Action Tracker, which does a great job of sort of synthesizing all these sort of different factors. There is no single agreed framework as to what a fair contribution to a global temperature target is. There is some debate as to whether the emphasis should be on historical responsibility or the emphasis should be on cost effectiveness, for example. But I think for a country like the United States, for example, there is a disproportionate historical responsibility. There is a high level of capability compared to other countries. And I would say there's probably a high level of cost effectiveness as well. So if we're talking about something like a net zero by 2050 target, we really want to, which is a global target, for the US, we actually really want to be talking about sort of net zero and then net negative emissions well before 2050. If the US is to make an equitable contribution to the global burden of emissions reductions. So this is why it can be quite frustrating in Oregon, for example, where the current state target is just 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, because Oregon is a state that would have, globally speaking, a disproportionate responsibility, a high level of capability, and can probably do so in a more cost-effective way than elsewhere. Next slide, please. And so I do want to try and get through the rest of my slides fairly quickly, but feasibility is another issue with international climate governance. I was listening to the final episode of the first season of the Generation Green New Deal podcast a few days ago, and they were interviewing Bill McKibben, and he sort of said that, the math is brutal, and he's right. We are looking at 7.6% emissions reductions every year for the next decade to be sort of in line with the 1.5 degree temperature target. And every year that we don't achieve that level of emissions reductions, that number goes higher. And there is really no sort of historical precedent or parallel for this, other than maybe the deindustrialization that occurred, following the collapse of the USSR. So it's a very daunting challenge, and it's something that sort of the elephant in the room in a lot of these discussions, but that just sort of, to me, creates an even greater impetus in taking action as soon as possible and making sure that the demands are the right ones. Next slide, please. And this sort of limited feasibility to achieve a 1.5 degree target has actually been acknowledged by the Ipcc in its 2018 special report. And so the first scenario on the left is one that's compatible with 1.5 degrees, but it says that, that this is only really going to be achieved if there are major social, cultural, and technological shifts that decouple energy use and demand from quality of life. So, quality of life exists for much of the global, quality of life increases for much of the global south, but without the sort of associated energy demand and use that has sort of characterized that sort of increase in quality of life by conventional measures, which we could, critique in the past. P2 is also 1.5 degree path, but involves a significant amount of technical sequestration. So things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture, as well as sort of natural sequestration, which is things like afforestation, reforestation, changes in soil management and the like. Next slide, please. And the sort of reality of feasibility that has been acknowledged by the Ipcc has led to some debate amongst climate advocates as to the merits of exploring negative emissions technologies such as carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, et cetera, et cetera. One of the sort of strongest and most thorough cases made against putting any attention on these technologies is from the Center for International Environmental Law, which, just to very briefly summarize it, points out that most of these negative emissions technologies are being promoted by fossil fuel companies as a way to continue extracting fossil fuels and emitting, and that these technologies are by and large unproven, except as a way of sort of supporting fossil fuel production. So enhanced oil recovery is an example of that. And we included this in the readings for the syllabus, Femi Taiwo's article, An African Case for Carbon Renewal, is a good sort of rebuttal or counterpoint to this argument, in that, it calls for a politics where carbon removal is in the service of systemic change and decolonialism, rather than in the interest of fossil fuel companies, and basically sort of puts the question, why can't we use it towards these ends and not the ends of the fossil fuel industry? Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and it's just to sort of point out that both in its own right and as sort of a segue to Nick's portion of the presentation, that we don't have that kind of politics that Femi is talking about right now. In fact, sort of institutionally, the international regime of free trade and globalization and neoliberalism kind of undermines a lot of sort of innovative renewable energy, Green New Deal style policies at the domestic level. And so I've included an example on this slide that I believe was mentioned in Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything from Canada, but there's also a link in the quote for the first article that talks about some recent cases where essentially domestic renewable energy policies that incentivize local production of renewable energy components and manufacturing have been found to be in breach of international trade laws. And this is just one example of how a lot of the sort of broader international law and institutional architecture is not built around a sort of Green New Deal paradigm. It's built around a neoliberal paradigm, and it will be something that domestic advocates will also have to deal with. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks guys. So yeah, I'm gonna pivot here. I'm gonna try to keep it to about 10, 12 minutes, just so that we have more time for questions. So we've covered basically the sort of like international framework piece, what's going on in terms of like international institutions, formally different techniques like lawsuits and what's working and what's not. And generally speaking, not much is working in the way of reducing carbon emissions. And so I want to get maybe a little bit deeper into why that is, and suggest some ways of just thinking about problems and transition strategies that might get us to at least building the architecture for that transition. So first slide says just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions. And this was an article from The Guardian in 2017. And basically the idea is that, where I'm going to go with this is that there are a couple different ways that we can talk about responsibility in the transition, and there are a couple of different ways we can talk about the climate crisis, and how we understand that is really important to how we choose to transition. And so one thesis is that kind of like climate change is a humanity problem, as sort of humanity is an undifferentiated mass. And we kind of collectively have caused this through, the use of fossil fuels and our land use practices, deforestation. But because, a good percentage of humanity benefits from the consumption of this, then we're sort of all to blame. And a different way of thinking about that I prefer, actually, because I think it helps to frame the political choices ahead, is to think about the causes as the result of the techniques, a specific kind of techniques that's been on display for 500 years almost, which is, we can call it capitalism now, but to think about it as the capitalazine instead of the Anthropocene, where we're at right now. So one of the readings that I listed for today were some stuff from Jason W. Moore. And I'm going to read a couple quotes here to frame it, and then I'm going to get into the details of some of the energy transitions that are happening right now, and both thinking about what it means for us, and maybe how we can start to design alternative institutions that can kind of like take us to a different way of doing things. So here's a quote from Anthropocene or Capitalzine, which is an article that Moore wrote a few years back. Story of humanity and nature conceals a dirty secret of modern world history. That secret is how capitalism was built on excluding most humans from humanity: indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, nearly all women, and even many white-skinned men. From the perspective of imperial administrators, merchants, planters, and conquistadors, these humans were not human at all. They were regarded as a part of nature, along with trees, soils, and rivers, and treated accordingly. The symbolic, material, and bodily violence of this audacious separation, humanity and nature, performed a special kind of work for the modern world. Backed by imperial power and capitalist rationality, it mobilized the unpaid work and energy of human, especially women, especially the enslaved, in service to transforming landscapes with a singular purpose: the endless accumulation of capital. So the idea is that this is a techniques that's been on display since the 1450s, basically, and we've had many, many cycles of accumulation. We had Spanish cycle of accumulation that was colonial in nature, and silver and indigenous people being enslaved were major components of that. You have a Dutch cycle of accumulation, you've got a British cycle of accumulation, and now we find ourselves in an American cycle of accumulation that's very based on fossil fuels as sort of a cheap nature. So when I talk about capitalism, and this I think is the same as Moore, I don't mean just in the economics of it, I mean as a broader system that has many, many different pieces. So it's neither a purely economic nor social system, but a historically situated complex of metabolism and assemblages. So last week, Femi kind of quipped when he was talking about racial capitalism. He says, I always go back to 1492 and people are always teasing me, but I think it does make a lot of sense for us to maintain that historical memory and to understand how and why this system has functioned for as long as it has, and to understand that technologies have changed, and maybe the expression of those technologies have changed in the past 500 years, but ultimately accumulation in the sense of capital pretty much works the same way that it does. And that is, it tries to get something for free or cheap. Basically, the value that's measured within capitalist exchange comes from devaluing humans and non-human nature. Since the 1970s, the form of capitalism that we exist under, we call neoliberalism. And this specific form is one of financialization. You say a movement away from like an industrial or real economy toward one of the creation of money off of money. It's one where the power of states and international institutions has been massively reduced, and many new international institutions have been created in order to sort of facilitate this financial power. And wealth and power have sort of accumulated in smaller and smaller hands, and most of that is exercised through the private realm. I don't believe that there's a such thing as a free market. So I think that states are really important as sites for the exercise of this power, but I think it's important to know that, you know, we can think about it as like billionaires, right? Like there's a person with billions of dollars. That person has a lot of power. They have the ability to own however much they want. And a system has sort of existed in order to produce that. And that social power is exercised not only through the capacity of like moving governments, but through NGOs and things like that. So anyway, that's just a background to start thinking about some major changes that are coming to the economy right now. And in my estimation, this sort of cycle of accumulation that was based on cheap fossil energy is coming to an end, if it hasn't already. You know, arguably, even without a plague that drew the oil economy to a halt last March, the fossil returns on fossil capital have been declining for decades now. You had a sort of like a resurgence in American production and Canadian production sort of like 20 years ago under the George W. Bush regime, kind of giving away public lands for very, very cheap in order to just maybe subsidize some of the harder to get energy. But ultimately the returns on the substances are just no longer what they used to be. The eras of cheap energy are over. And so capital, rather than accept continuing decline in profit, will seek other investment areas if it can find them. So where is capital going right now? It looks like just in the last sort of 6 months here that we're going to have a big shift toward a renewable energy economy, which in some ways is good, but it also presents certain dangers and things to look for. So this is an article from the Financial Times, which I confess that I do not read regularly, but I saw it just come through my feed, and it's been paywalled since I read it. So apologies, it was in the syllabus for a while. There's a quote in here. It's actually from the financial side, a pretty good estimation of what states are doing right now to embrace a green energy economy. Here's a quote: "But as the energy system changes, so will energy politics. For most of the past century, geopolitical power was intimately connected to fossil fuels. The fear of an oil embargo or gas shortage was enough to forge alliances or start wars, and access to oil deposits conferred great wealth. In the world of clean energy, a new set of winners and losers will emerge. Some see it as a clean energy space race. Countries or regions that master clean technology, export clean energy, or import fossil fuels stand to gain from the system, while those that rely on exporting fossil fuels, such as the Middle East or Russia, could see their power decline." So financial press is sort of announcing a big change here. Another article came across in preparation, estimates that $9 trillion hole will hit states that have been focused primarily on the production of fossil fuels in the near future if you do see this kind of transition to renewables. Here's just a picture of some of the, at least in this article, the way that they tiered this were sort of like the amount of the economy of a state that was based in fossil revenues. Go back and read that sometime. You know, other developments that are kind of happening around this that are pushing this forward, because again, it's not just a matter of sort of free markets and pricing, but actually like a reorientation of the institutions of global economy. The European Union has announced a Green Deal, for example, and just this year started to put numbers to that. I think they started with like a $1 trillion number. It probably is on the smaller end of what it would take to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the time that they're announcing, but it's still a significant event. And folks that follow this closely will also know that tucked in there are a lot of subsidies for gas and other things. So it's not as clean or renewable as it is on its face, but still it's a massive investment in sort of like pulling off of coal and oil and traditional fuels that powered European economy for a long time. And I think Europe is something like the 20%, they buy like 20% of the world's fossil fuels still right now. So this is a significant move. Similarly, in the United States, you know, we're starting to see a lot of articles say things like Biden's going to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels. And these are in the, you know, estimates and sometimes in the hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies. If you include the American capacity to make war and sort of the historic partnerships between the United States and governments like Saudi Arabia and guaranteeing a steady stream of oil, et cetera, et cetera. These costs could be more than that. I mean, you could consider the whole entire military machine of the United States in some ways a subsidy of this, especially considering the US military is the largest user of fossil fuels in the world. So these are major changes, especially if you, the United States is the kind of like the chief country and guarantor of world capitalism. Making moves like these are significant. There are some legal questions about what can be done with executive order, how serious, there's also questions about how serious Biden and folks are, but what has to happen through the United States Congress in order to make this stuff happen. But still a trajectory has been shown, and the cabinet appointees of the Biden administration also seem to come into things with this in mind. So my kind of questions here are, all right, so we're making a big renewables transition. Maybe we have better land use practices as well. I still am trying to figure out where does the value come from if the measures in the economy are based on accumulation. I don't think that just replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, even if it's more cost effective, is going to really get us to where we're going. And so I'm concerned about where the new sort of like sources of cheap food and resources come from. And this is something that, in the context of what we already know about rare earth minerals mining, definitely what comes to mind are regimes in the developing world for extracting those rare earth minerals and the horrible labor practices and just the scale of what would need to be done in order to get enough rare earth minerals to transition just one country like the United States to being like a total electric car economy or something like that. And I think that there's a lot more detail to go into in this, and just in the interest of time, I'd rather kind of wind it down and get into questions. But questions that are not really answerable in this moment, by me at least, but I would like to think about for the rest of this course. And maybe we can ask some of our speakers all right, so what are if we buy into the description of what the capitalist techniques are, what are the frontiers and resources that capitalism will attempt to capture for cheap or free for the next cycle of accumulation? Or on the other hand, is this a terminal crisis for accumulation? Have we run out of frontiers? And if so, what are the consequences of that? How will an energy transition affect human rights, international justice, and the integrity of ecosystems and species? Third, what international institutions already exist that are capable of moderating potential impacts of capitalism in this transition, or serving as a template for a transition to something else or better? Sort of what institutions do we need to build to achieve human rights, international justice, intergenerational justice, and a better relationship between humanity and non-human nature? How do we build them? So political questions as well, that I hope we will address. We've got a bunch of really, really awesome speakers in this course that I think will bite off pieces of this along the way. So just to suggest a few that I'm familiar with that at least feel ripe for the transitional elements here. I agree with Femi that reparations basically have to be a part of any kind of climate justice move. And you can base that on sort of legacies of colonialism, contributions to CO2 in the atmosphere. I think also there are elements of like intergenerational justice that should be factored in, but figuring out how to move resources from the, let's call it like the winners of the last sort of cycles of accumulation to people who've suffered and been devalued, and that seems appropriate. Exploring ideas of sort of like recommoning, using modern legal institutions in order to manage areas to decommodify and then manage according to local regional needs. There are some really interesting projects going on in the world of commoning right now. Trusts, Danny and Jay and I have worked in organizations that have sort of like advocated for different use of trusts in systems that derive from the English legal tradition, it can be maybe a useful tool of like creating a legal instrument that can communicate with broader property relations and things like that in order to sort of like build in some protections for ecosystems or people. And rights of nature frameworks are also potentially useful there for just sort of communicating with existing juridical political institutions. Much more to go into around that. I hope we get the chance. But for now, let's me shut up and see if we can get some of these questions in with the time that we've got left. Sherry, do you find any questions in there that you wanna bump up here? Or I can walk through this too. And any of the other panelists, if you've seen any questions out of here that you want to take on, feel free to jump in. I have my screen sharing, so I haven't seen any of these yet.
Nick, I might just address a question in the Q&A box from Michael Brennan. I'll just read it out for the benefit of everyone listening. If Ipcc and Unfccc have a conservative filter due to its stakeholders, which is something I mentioned, is there a preferred alternative for assessments on climate timelines? For example, the Ipcc recommends global 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 for 1.5 degrees Celsius target, but I've heard US eco-socialists demand US decarbonization by 2030. Is there a scientific body that supports the latter? I mean, the short answer is no, and I might just make sure that I'm sort of clear on that. The Ipcc is saying, or the sort of thing to keep in mind, that a 1.5 degree temperature target, as I sort of showed with the sort of brutal math of the 7.6% annual reductions, is already kind of pushing up against the limits of what's feasible globally. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a bad target at this point, because it's sort of really sort of pushing the bounds of what we think is feasible based on sort of the modeling of emissions trajectories. The 50% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050 kind of range is one of them sort of more aggressive emissions models that the Ipcc put in their 1.5 degree report. I think probably the most aggressive would be sort of around sort of 55 to 60% reductions by 2030 globally, and net zero in the early to mid 2040s. And that would give you sort of around, I think, sort of 370, 380 parts per million CO2. I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, but I'll explain that in a moment. And probably sort of 1.2 to 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100, which is not too bad. That's pretty close to what even sort of, some of the individual papers that are sort of pushing for a harder target, such as the work of James Hansen, are saying, is necessary to stabilize the climate. I think where there's a bit of a confusion and disconnect in terms of some domestic demands in the US for decarbonization by 2030 is whether we're talking about emissions reductions across all sectors or just emissions reductions in the energy sector. Decarbonization by 2030 in the energy sector, there is literature to support that. I'm sort of thinking of some of the work of Stanford professor Mark Jacobson, who's done some of the sort of energy systems modeling, and there's other authors and other models and institutions that think that kind of rapid decarbonization of the energy sector, the electricity sector, is feasible. And that's actually consistent with sort of what the US would probably need to do as a sort of proportionate contribution to a global net zero by 2050 target, because energy or electricity is the low-hanging fruit in terms of different sectors of the economy. Things like agriculture and transportation are a little bit more difficult to decarbonize completely. And sort of decarbonization there would occur later in order for sort of all sectors to decarbonize on a particular timeline. So I think that's what US eco-socialists are getting at there, to the extent that they're sort of referring to any literature. And then just finally, in terms of what you could sort of look to figure out what the US's sort of fair or equitable contribution to a 1.5 degree target would be. The climate action tracker that's put together by Climate Analytics does try to sort of synthesize some of the approaches to burden sharing and sort of give an indication of what sort of level of emissions reductions would be necessary. So you could take a look at that, and I've linked to that in the slides.
I'll jump in and grab another question from Valerie. Can you give an example of interesting work that's happening at the moment focused on commenting? Yeah, most of what I'm familiar with is in the realm of cities. That's where I've looked at it the most, but I know a lot of, especially cities that are being crunched by a lot of tourism that's kind of driving out their residents and like driving up housing prices and stuff, are exploring kind of like commons mapping projects of like existing common spaces, and then redefining sort of like, or maybe not redefining, defining new elements of kind of their city as like a part of a commons that they try to modify. And then once that kind of analytical choice has been made, then you follow it up with a policy framework such as like restricting tourism or something like that in order to kind of protect that area. The most simple way of doing it can just be like, you know, a plot of land that's presently being managed for extractive purposes. Like, let's say, you know, it's kind of like Garrett Hardin's tragedy of commons thing, right? Is infected everybody into believing that, even a lot of like lefties into believing that if you allow people to sort of like manage land by themselves, that they'll deplete it really quickly. It's quite the opposite. It seems that the profit motive makes you deplete land and resources a lot quicker. But taking land, essentially drawing a big line around it, kind of in the same way that you might with private property, but declaring it managed for different purposes, adding in a new charter or democracy decision making to figure out what those resources to be used for, can actually like reduce intensity. Eleanor Ostrom did a bunch of work on this with her Nobel Prize and kind of try to trot out to document different types of like resource management that was traditionally like we would call commons, and I could put you with that. And then there is a article that just got linked. I haven't read it yet, but Linda linked an article to Vaughn and Ashiva calling for new commons. It's in there for folks to look into a little bit more. But yeah, I know less about it in the kind of like land management and forestry areas, but I do know that there are a lot of really interesting authors that are exploring that kind of work, like Bram Boucher, for example, wrote a lot about that as it relates to conservation. Let's see, what else do we have here? And Heather added some more details about Bram Boucher. There's a comment that I wanted to address here from Heather Molina. It was in response to some of the stuff that I was running through like way too quick. She says energy efficiency and demand side management and flexible load are a lot less resource intensive and far less talked about, and she will be presenting on that on March 31st. I think just kind of timing wise, that probably would have been like the most appropriate thing we could have talked about, is having Heather today, just based on what's going on in the US right now with the grids basically in multiple places across this country all kind of like collapsing at the same time, and a lot of finger pointing of sort of what's happening and why. And yeah, so on March 31st, Heather's going to talk a lot about basically those themes and sort of what the existing grid is like and how we transition to something that might answer some of the challenges that I brought up today. Let's see. There's a couple questions, Danny, that might fit into your realm here. One, I've lost it, but it was about the comment you made about Oregon, and it was basically asking if you were referring to the capacity of kind of Northwest forests to store carbon.
Yeah, I answered that in the chat, and in short, yes, that's one of the things I was talking about in terms of capacities, is the sequestration and storage capacity on Oregon's forests and even agricultural lands. And we'll be hearing more about the forest piece on April 7 in this course. There's also a question about the International Energy Agency's Road to Net Zero report. Admittedly, I wasn't particularly familiar with it, but just looking at the press release for it, I'm extremely skeptical if they are producing a roadmap to net zero by 2050 in the energy sector alone. That's way too slow, and it's not 1.5 degree compatible, in my opinion. There is a model called the One Earth model that's worth checking out. I'll include a link to that in the chat. But yeah, I'm highly skeptical of that report.
Any final questions that folks want to pose before we start to wind down?
We have a raised hand from Julie O, so I'm gonna allow to talk.
Okay. Go ahead, Julie. Accidental raised hand. All right. Well, we're at 5:30, been going for an hour and a half. Maybe a good time to wind things down and just give folks a little bit of a taste of what's coming up. So next week we have Thea Riofrancos, who just wrote a book. I'm just chewing through it now, called Resource Radicals. That's really, really good. She's a professor at Providence in Rhode Island, and also a eco-socialist, very dynamic speaker. And I'm really excited for next week. So that's coming up, and she'll be continuing the theme of sort of the international elements of a justice-based Green New Deal or just transition. And then the week after that, we have Camila Bustos, who's at Yale Law School, who's going to talk about climate migration. And she's also on the board of Breach Collective, so she's close to home. We hope you'll join us for that. And then the week after that, we've got Mitch Green, who's a PhD economist who works in the energy sector as well, who's going to be talking about financing and economy of the Green New Deal. So we've got some really exciting stuff coming up. If folks want to, I mean, I'm super interested in continuing conversations in between classes. We've got Discord, which I never used until recently, but it seems functional enough to be able to continue dialogue. So, you know, some of these conversations around like the commons or alternative institutions and frameworks that didn't really have as much time to develop in this class here, would love to chat with folks about it and to learn from y'all and to share thoughts that we have at Breach. Again, our goal in providing this course is to allow people to share ideas, networks, get in touch with big thinkers, and then kind of think together about how we can move not only the discussions, but our physical and material reality. Because not just enough to dream and think big, those are parts of it, but what are the politics at stake? How do we move things, and how do we get to where we need to go? So thanks everyone for joining. Sorry about my notifications running across the top of my screen. I'll fix that for next time. And we will see you next week, and hopefully in between classes and Discord and email and otherwise. So thanks, Jay. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Sherry. And thanks everybody participating. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you.